if there's one thing that you take away from reading chapter 15, I would like it to be that Gestalt psychology, which is the topic of this chapter, is not the same thing as Gestalt therapy, which you may have heard of if you've taken a theories of personality class or theories of counseling class in the past. This is a common misconception that the two are somehow the same or related. But while it's a misconception, it's not necessarily without basis. I mean, we can't deny the fact that the words are the same. Fitz-Perls, who invented, if you will, Gestalt therapy, had used some of the writings of the Gestalt theorists, who we'll talk about in this chapter. But these theories distanced themselves from Fitz-Perls, claiming that he misconstrued their work and that Gestalt, the theory, is a broader philosophical system. It's a worldview that is intended to be a way to approach science as a whole. Gestalt theorists emphasize the roles of past experience and present conditions, but they don't confine themselves to personality theory alone like Gestalt therapy does. So that is the big misconception and something I want you to keep in mind as you work on reading this chapter. So let's take a look at what the Gestalt system, Gestalt theory, is. Gestalt, the word itself, as many foreign words, does not have a direct translation into English. Some common translations of the word are configuration, form, pattern, structure, and holistic, because the system focuses on the relationships of parts. Gestalt theory can be traced back to Kant's approach to empiricism and rationalism, and has a distinctive relativity flavor when it comes to its approach to perception. The basic Gestalt principle is that the whole is different from the sum of its parts. This is to mean that the whole isn't just greater than the sum of its parts, it's radically different. So you can think of this concept in terms of baking bread, for example. The loaf is drastically different in its baked form from the raw ingredients that went into making it. So when you bake a loaf of bread and you get it out of the oven and it's got the really great smell and everything, it's hard to imagine that all of that happened because you had some white powder, which was flour, some other white powder, which was baking soda, some kind of cream-colored powder, which is the yeast, and so on. Because the baked part of the bread, the whole, the end result, is very, very different. And that's how you can kind of think about Gestalt principle. The Gestalt theories that you'll need to be familiar with as we go through this chapter are Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Koffka. We'll be discussing the basics of Gestalt psychology through their work and their definitions. Wertheimer is essentially the father of Gestalt and promoted Gestalt not as an isolated theory, but as a worldview. Kohler brought Gestalt psychology to the States in 1935. He was a big activist, if you will, or a person who really opposed the Nazi regime in Germany. And he was a prolific researcher and writer. Lastly, Koffka is best known for applying Gestalt theory to developmental psychology. And we'll discuss each of their contributions and their work further as we go through the chapter, but I wanted you to be aware of the three men who we'll be talking most about. To understand Gestalt psychology better, let's look at its fundamental elements. The formal founding of Gestalt is attributed to Max Wertheimer, as I just mentioned, and his experiments on the phi phenomenon in 1910. The phi phenomenon is essentially an optical illusion of apparent movement, though there is no movement, just two discrete stationary objects shown in succession. This is essentially what's behind stop motion animation or those flip books where you draw the little guy with his hands up and down and then lower and lower on the edge of a book, and then you kind of flip through it. The phi phenomenon is an illustration of the whole being different than its parts. The parts are static lights or objects or drawings, but the whole is the entire movement effect. Of course, this kind of makes it seem that Gestalt is mostly about perception, but that's not the case. Gestalt is primarily a psychology of thinking, a kind of antecedent to cognitive psychology. We see the focus on thought process in Wertheimer's writing on reproductive versus productive thinking, which you can think of as rote learning versus critical thinking. Applying the Gestalt principle to the thinking process further, Gestalt theory organizes its fundamental principles into what is called the law of pragnance, which consists of figure-ground principle, similarity principle, proximity principle, closure principle, and continuation principle. All of these together operate under the Gestaltian assumption that we perceive our world in as organized and coherent way as the conditions at the moment permit. And lastly, no discussion of thinking can ignore learning, and Gestaltian theorists address learning from a very anti-behavioristic position, emphasizing not the stimulus response reward theory, but that learning involves more cognitive work. Another Gestaltian challenge to the stimulus response theory was Kohler's idea of insight, which he defined as the ability to understand a problem in context and restructure the existing relationship to come up with a solution. Now, it was Kurt Kafka who applied the Gestalt principles to human development and brought them into a realm we more directly associate with psychology, at least in the realm of developmental psychology. I should say, Kafka believed that early learning is sensory-motor in nature, a concept that we later saw in Piaget's theory. He also believed that much of learning occurs through imitation, and that the highest type of learning was ideational learning, which uses language. He noted that a very important time in a child's life is when they begin to understand that objects have names and begin to apply language. As I mentioned before, Gestalt theory was an approach to science, particularly psychology, and their approach was deeply rooted in the theory's opposition to behaviorism and structuralism. Kohler accused psychology of trying to model itself on the later stages of developed sciences, and he believed psychology should model itself after the earlier stages of physical sciences, focusing on the experiences of daily life instead of quantitative methods. His focus was phenomena and process, and he warned that too much emphasis on quantification would lead to neglect of important areas that are not easily quantified. Gestalt theory also held a position on the mind and brain, and as part of it, rejected any model of the way the brain worked that likened it to a machine. The theorists focus on the whole rather than the elements that made up the whole, prompted them to see the brain as more complex than just a machine. According to Kohler, the way to explain the mind-brain relationship was through isomorphism, the correspondence between an experience and the underlying brain process. So far, we've only looked at Gestalt as it relates to thinking and cognition. However, as I mentioned, Gestalt was more than just cognitive psychology. It was a worldview, which means it's applicable to many different arenas. One person who broadened the purview of Gestalt was Kurt Lewin. He discussed individual and social behavior in Gestalt terms. His theory was called field theory and stressed that a person and his environment are interdependent, thus making his approach more holistic and encompassing when it comes to understanding the complexities of social interaction and day-to-day functioning and behavior. Though Gestalt psychology course requirements at universities are almost as rare these days as Wundt's structuralism course requirements, which is to say you almost never see them, and if you do, it's probably a program that really just focuses on history of psychology. Gestalt still has relevance and influence in psychology today. Gestalt theories such as George Katona and Catherine Stern have influenced the psychology of education, teaching, and mathematical education. Heinrich Schult, Ademar Gelb, and Kurt Goldstein, they've influenced psychology. They've influenced psychotherapy, and Rudolf Arnheim has influenced the psychology of art. So we see the influences of these Gestalt theorists. We also see the continued relevance of Gestalt psychology as our focus as a discipline becomes less focused on elements and more focused on the context and the whole. We also see the influence of the Gestalt perspective in contemporary fields of psychology, particularly cognitive psychology, when it comes to memory and cognition, perception, and artificial intelligence.